It's so good to be back preaching. I took the whole month of May off. We had a couple missionaries. I preached in Africa, but not here. And if you were here last week, you met my favorite person on the planet, Dr. Ron Hardin, as he shared. If you missed last week and you messaged me, or you thought about messaging me and didn't, the video was lost. So there's no, okay, so you should have been here last week. You take the holiday weekend to be gone, sometimes the video dies. So, and then also the previous week before that, our missionaries are in a sensitive country, and so that video couldn't go up. So that's, if you're wondering where the last 2 weeks were online, that's where they are. I didn't take them with me to Africa and leave them and forget them. So hey, we're starting. It's summer in a couple weeks. It already feels like it if you don't have blackout curtains in your bedroom and you're like me and the sun comes up at like 4 something in the morning and I wake up like at the crack of light. But we're starting our summer series today. All summer long, we're going to be going through the life of David. And if you were here about a year ago in the spring, we did a series on the life of Elijah. That was a little bit shorter. The Bible gives us less information about Elijah, but it was one of my favorite series that we've done since we've been here, almost 2 years coming up this fall, and it ended in such a powerful way. It created some good momentum for us as a church, and so this summer, as we kick off this Life of David series, I'm hoping that it accomplishes the same things. I like doing these Bible character studies where we're just going to go right through the scriptures and his life, and so this summer, we're going to examine the life of King David, BK, not Burger King, before King. And you can't have it your way, as we're going to see in the life of David. But David is one of the most relatable characters in the entire Bible to me. And so as we go through his life, I hope that you see parallels to your life. I hope that you're going to see things that David thinks that you think. I hope that you see things that David does that you do. And some of those will be good things. Some of those won't be so good things. But I think as we go through the life of David, you can put yourself into the story as well and see yourself and see how God works in his life and how he wants to work in your life. And so as I was prepping, I've been prepping for this for months now, and I have like 20 weeks worth of stuff to get through the life of David. So this summer is before King, and I think what we'll do is next summer, it'll be part 2 of our summer series. You know how like when you binge watch a show on Netflix or Hulu or whatever you stream, and then you're like, oh, when I used to watch an episode every week and it was 20-something episodes, I only had to wait about half a year before my show to restart. This will be like when you watch everything on the day it comes out and then you wait a whole year for it to restart again. And so that's what we'll do. We'll do When He Becomes King next summer, unless I change my mind, and then you'll never know what happens. If you want to cheat every week, you can read ahead. I'll give you the verses at the end of every service. So before you come on Sunday, read it, and then you can know, kind of be primed as you come in. So if you have a Bible, 1 Samuel chapter 16, verses 1 to 13. We're going to work through them progressively today, but they'll also be on the screen for you. Let me read the beginning of chapter 16. Now the Lord said to Samuel, "You have mourned long enough for Saul. I have rejected him as king of Israel, so fill your flask with olive oil and go to Bethlehem. Find a man named Jesse who lives there, for I have selected one of his sons to be my king." But Samuel asked, "How can I do that? If Saul hears about it, he will kill me." "Take a heifer with you," the Lord replied, "and say that you have come to make a sacrifice to the Lord. Invite Jesse to the sacrifice, and I will show you which of his sons to anoint for me." Now, Israel, a little bit before this time, had complained and they'd whined to God that they wanted to be ruled by a king. In just a little bit before the book of Judges, they had judges who would run God's people. And so they cried about it. They said, everyone around us has a king, so we also want a king. And so God finally hears their cries, and he gives them a man named Saul, who was the first king of Israel. Now, Saul was your typical looking king. He was tall, he was handsome, the kind of guy you would look at and think, that guy looks like a king. Now, unfortunately, because Saul wasn't a good, godly king, God rejects him. He says, you guys got what you wanted, and now you don't have a great one. And so God rejects him. He disobeyed God earlier. He'd taken some matters into his own hands rather than following the Lord's instructions. And so we pick up the story here in history where Samuel, who was God's prophet or kind of the mouthpiece to God's people, had been in mourning for Israel and its king. So Samuel loves the people. He sees, like, God, I'm so bummed out. We finally got this king that the people wanted. That's not how you had planned for us, but you did it. And then we got a king, and he looked like a great king, but God, he's terrible. And so Samuel is just devastated over this, and he's praying, and he's mourning this situation. And finally, God speaks to Samuel and says, it's time to go find the next king. And Samuel should be excited, right? His prayers have been answered, and instead he realizes the result of that means I have to go find a replacement king, but we have a bad king. And so he's scared for his own life, because when the current king finds out that his prophet is anointing a new king, death would be certain to follow. Does God ever tell you to do something where you're going to die for it? No. You're like, we're not to the David part yet. It shouldn't be relatable quite yet. Samuel is very concerned. And so many of us, we like to think that we're in the will of God. And when we're in the will of God, that things should be perfect. If I'm in the will of God, I shouldn't have trouble. I should be happy. I should be blessed, right? The windows of heaven should be poured out over me. And I should be swimming in vats of money like Scrooge McDuck. That's how you know you're in the will of God, right? Is everything's perfect. And sometimes we tend to think that if there's hardship, we're out of the will of God. And Samuel, by following God's will, he's putting his life at risk. And sometimes I think you and I, we might confuse difficulty with being out of God's will. So I want to affirm for you today, if you're facing all kinds of trouble, difficulty, challenge, discouragement, it doesn't mean you're out of the will of God. In fact, it might mean you're perfectly in the will of God. And so God instructs him on exactly what to do. And if God calls you to do something, he will give you the plan for how to execute it. Right? Sometimes God just tells you something. You're like, well, I could never do that. Right. You could never do that. God will do it in you. And then you're like, well, how am I going to figure it out? You don't have to know the how. When God tells you something, you just be obedient to that and you do it. And if you remember last week, Dr. Hardin said, obedience always results in blessing. So if God tells it to you, you just be obedient to that and you do it, right? So verse 4, so Samuel did as the Lord instructed. When he arrived at Bethlehem, the elders of the town came trembling to meet him. What's wrong? They asked. Do you come in peace? You thought that was like a question for aliens. That's from the Bible hundreds of years, thousands of years ago. Not only is Samuel worried about what God is telling him to do and for his life, then he goes to Bethlehem and the people hear the prophet is coming and they're worried. They're afraid, oh no, if God has sent the prophet to us, something terrible is happening. And have you ever done something wrong? And then someone in authority started talking to you, right? Maybe you messed up at work and then your boss comes in, or when you were a kid, you did something wrong and your parents come talk to you. And someone in authority starts talking to you and they shouldn't know whatever it is that you did, or that like it's in the back of your head, like, do they know? I got to figure this out. Do I be honest? Am I going to have to lie about something? And right, that fear just kind of wells up inside of you. Well, that's Bethlehem when they hear the prophets coming. And that's Samuel when God tells him what he's supposed to be doing. And sometimes my kids will accidentally tell on themselves just because I just ask them like, what'd you do? And they're like guilty hearts just start confessing things. I was like, I didn't know any of that. God only speaks to your mom about the things you did wrong. And so they'll just tell on themselves because they're like that little voice. They're like, oh, he must know. There's no way to know some of these things. And so that's what's going on in this situation. Bethlehem is worried. And so if the people are worried, they know like, oh, God sent someone because we have been naughty. And fortunately for them, Samuel puts their mind at ease. Verse 5, yes, Samuel replied, I have come to sacrifice to the Lord. Purify yourselves and come with me to the sacrifice. Then Samuel performed the purification rite for Jesse and his sons and invited them to the sacrifice too. Verse 6, when they arrived, Samuel took one look at Eliab and thought, surely this is the Lord's anointed. Eliab looked the part. He was the oldest son, and like Saul, he was tall and handsome, a natural leader, probably a warrior. And as the oldest son of Jesse, it would be the one who would be most likely in line to inherit everything or to receive this kind of blessing and promotion. Samuel, God's mouthpiece, takes one look at this guy and instantly knows this is God's choice. Eliab would have been the choice candidate. If you and I were picking, if we had the sons all lined up, you'd say that's the one. He was the obvious choice of the lineup of sons. In verse 7, the Lord said to Samuel, "Don't judge by his appearance or height, for I have rejected him." The Lord doesn't see things the way you see them. People judge by outward appearance, but the Lord looks at the heart. Lesson 1 in the life of David, before we've even met David, is found here in verse 7. God doesn't see things the way you see things. This is a lesson you need to learn, and it's good if you learn it pretty early on, because you see things and you feel certain things, and then you think about God in certain ways, but God doesn't look at all the outside things that you and I see. The part that we can't see is, in fact, the part that God cares most about. What's going on underneath the surface? The things that you and I can see, not super relevant to God when he's searching for people to use and choose. And so Samuel, who is trained in hearing from God and seeing on behalf of God, he makes a decision, and God has to quietly remind him, Samuel, you're not picking a king. I know you and I, we have some really good ideas, and I make suggestions to the Lord all the time. God, let me tell you how I think this ought to work. And then you maybe do the same thing. Maybe you do the same thing in your behavior. You don't even consult the Lord. You're just like, I'm just going to do this thing, and God, just come on with me, as opposed to like asking God, is this something you want me to do? And so God says, hey, Samuel, I don't need you to pick a king. I have already done that. And so this is a key part that we need to understand when it comes to David and to you and to me. It's the things that other people can see in your life are inconsequential to God. People can see your mistakes. All the failures that everyone looks to, people see those things. People can see your flaws. People can see the ugliness of the circumstances that maybe you've created for others, that you've been thrust into, or that others have put you into. People can see if you aren't physically attractive by society standards. Now, nobody in this church does that apply to, right? Everyone here is incredibly attractive, but for other people in other churches where they're ugly, come here, you're the most beautiful people in the world. Right? People can see the sin, even the secret sin that eventually gets found out. People can see all of these external things. And God says that the things that we use to judge and to formulate opinions about others is not how he judges. God looks at Eliab, the choice candidate, and says, I've rejected the one that you all assume I would pick. And then in verse 8, Jesse told his son Abinadab to step forward and walk in front of Samuel. But Samuel said, this is not the one the Lord has chosen. Next, Jesse summoned Shimea, and Samuel said again, neither is this the one the Lord has chosen. Verse 10, in the same way, all 7 of Jesse's sons were presented to Samuel. But Samuel said to Jesse, the Lord has not chosen any of these. We meet Eliab. We meet Abinadab, we meet Shimea by name, and then there's 4 more brothers who aren't even important enough to be named. Samuel doesn't have to consult the Lord on them. He just sees them and says, not that one, not that one, not that one. Aren't you glad God doesn't line up us that way? Nope. Like there's a lot of rejection going on here. And if Eliab, who looked the part, wasn't chosen, after the next 2 brothers, the kids aren't even special enough to name. Like, I want you to understand, God gives us some names. The rest are just the next 4 brothers. And so Samuel meets all 7 brothers and finds that God has chosen none of them. And if you remember, the verse says we've seen all 7 of the sons, and sometimes we face circumstances and we've run out of options. Have you ever got to the end of the line and you're like, it's hopeless. God, you told me to do this, and now there's nothing left. And so I do want to go back one verse too, because I found an error in our perfect Bible. Verse 10, it said all 7 of Jesse's sons. And the series that we're doing is about King David, and my man Jesse had 8 sons. And so the Bible's not wrong, just Jesse was wrong, because David's not even counted on the roster. The prophet comes, says, bring everyone. David doesn't even get invited. And so when Samuel gets to the end of the line, none is the next king, and he's probably freaking out. Right? Have you been in that situation before? You thought God spoke something to you only to find out you might have been wrong. It didn't come to pass in the time you thought it would. It didn't come to pass in the way that you thought it would. And now there's no more options, and you're at the end of the line. You're like, God, I thought you told me to do this. Why are you making me look like a fool? Half these kids aren't even important enough to name, and now Samuel's worried. Verse 11, then Samuel asks, are these all the sons you have? They're still the youngest, Jesse replied, but he's out in the fields watching the sheep and the goats. Send for him at once, Samuel said. We will not sit down until he arrives. Can we all agree that Jesse has displayed some bad parenting here? I'll just throw this out. You shouldn't leave your children out, or some children out, or some selected children out when everyone is being included in something. We took a family walk one time. We lived, she knows. We lived around the street from the high school, and we're just walking down to the field at the high school, and we get all the kids, and most of them are on bikes, and they kind of went ahead of us, and so we leave, and we walk around, and we get all the way down the street and to the high school and around a corner. And I don't know, if you have one kid, maybe you don't have to count them. When you have 5 kids, you're always counting them so that you know that they're all with you. Kind of like chickens. When they're all, you got to count them as they're moving. And so we get there, and we should normally have 5, and we have 1 in a stroller, and 1 is missing. And then you got to go through the names, like which one is which, who's not here. And Lydia was completely not there, and she was maybe 2 or 3. Like, you should remember the ones that can barely walk on their own. And so everyone freaks out. The kids rush back to the house. Lydia, we get there. She's on the porch crying, like, you forgot me. And that was unintentional, and she still talks about, like, the trauma from the time she wasn't important enough to be remembered, to be brought on the walk. It's like, it's not that you're not important. We just have too many of you, and we forgot. So that's not what happens here. Jesse chose, he's like, I know they want everybody, but they won't want this one, so we'll just take the rest of them. And the Bible doesn't tell us that Jesse has 8 sons until we've met all of the 3 with names, 4 that are unnamed. Like brother 4, 5, 6, and 7 are more important to Jesse, but the Bible doesn't think they're significant enough to tell us about them. And so to this point, right, language like all 7 of Jesse's sons is used, but he doesn't have 7 sons. David's dad excluded him from coming to meet the prophet who asked for the sons. And Jesse leaves one intentionally behind to babysit the animals. Now, if you look at the meaning of how they describe David, it's really insulting. We don't have his name yet, right? Jesse doesn't say, oh, yeah, someone go grab David. They say the youngest son is out with the sheep and the goats, and we read this and we tend to think youngest just means with the fewest amount of age, right? The youngest by age, but the term is used to describe David by Jesse, and it's very insulting. It means baby brother, and it's a dismissive term to describe David. He wasn't important enough to be brought to the meeting with the rest of the family, and Jesse is telling Samuel and everyone who is here to watch this ordeal, I have another son, the baby brother, not just baby, the youngest, baby brother, meaning like I'm disgusted. It's an insult to talk about this one, but he didn't count enough to be part of our family to be included in what God's doing. As a side note, parents, don't put negative labels like this on your kids. Don't make them feel inferior. Don't treat them like they're an afterthought. Don't intentionally exclude them from things or make them feel less than. Those wounds are carried for a lifetime. And Jesse doesn't care. He didn't have all the parenting books that we have today. He couldn't read the mommy blogs. And so Jesse just excludes David. And David is the runt of the litter. That's what baby brother means. And so he's the runt of the litter, and he's not worthy of being included in the family. Now, I call it a litter because 8 sons, my goodness, right? Could you imagine? And then when you're selecting a pet, the runt is the one that's unwanted. They're weak. They usually have issues physically, or there's extra medical things maybe, and they're a reject. They're less valuable. And that's what Jesse says about David to the prophet Samuel in front of all to see. And he says, we left David to scoop up sheep and goat manure because that's all his value is to this family. It never occurred to Jesse that David might be chosen by God. It might not have even occurred to him that David wasn't present for the son lineup. That's how insignificant David was to his father. And to Jesse and to David's brothers, he barely existed. And David lived under this constant rejection. He wasn't part of the group in the family. He wasn't part of all the things that they would do together. He was off doing his own thing. And people might look at you and ignore you. People might look at you and write you off. They might think of you as less than or insignificant. You might feel like a failure today. You may feel rejected or unloved. You might not look the part of a champion for Jesus, but David was and felt all these same things. He, by his family's sight, was a loser and a loner. And in verse 12, Jesse sent for him. He was dark and handsome with beautiful eyes, and the Lord said, "This is the one, anoint him." So as David stood there among his brothers, Samuel took the flask of olive oil that he had brought and anointed David with the oil. And the Spirit of the Lord came powerfully upon David from that day on. Then Samuel returned to Ramah. He gets anointed. The Spirit of the Lord falls on David. And for everything that David was not to his family, he was in the sight of God. For all the negative stuff that had been placed upon him, when God anoints you with oil, that's the Holy Spirit, all of that negative stuff, all the labels that have been placed on you, all the failures in life are washed off of you, and you are anointed by God. You are filled with his Spirit, and you are valuable to Jesus. He was special. He was chosen. And because Jesus came and died for you and I, you are special and you are chosen as well. Romans chapter 5, verse 8, Paul wrote, God shows his love for us in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us. You didn't earn it. You didn't deserve it. David didn't look the part. But God looked at him, and God looks at you and said, I choose you. You're so important to God that when you didn't deserve to be chosen by him, Jesus still came and died for you. Like David, who had no business receiving this blessing, you didn't deserve God's mercy and love. The psalmist writes in 139 verse 14, I praise you, for I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Wonderful are your works. My soul knows it very well. Your soul knows that you are chosen and made and created by God, but sometimes your life circumstances don't know it. Sometimes your brain doesn't know it. Sometimes your heart doesn't feel it, but your soul knows how valuable you are to God. You're intricately designed by the creator of the heavens and the earth. You aren't a mistake. The difficulties that you face are not a punishment from God. It doesn't mean you're out of God's will. It doesn't mean he's doing this to you. He designed you with great intention, and he did a wonderful job. And then he chose to set you apart for his glory to bring him praise, just like he did with David. Ephesians chapter 2, Verse 10 says, "For we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. He planned them for you." There are good things waiting for you in your future that God has already planned for you. I want you to understand about an artist's workmanship, right? It's their crowning achievement. It's the thing that they will be known for. It's Da Vinci's Mona Lisa. I think we have a pic. Like, I look at that and I just think, like, it's not that great of an art. Like, she gasped. It's also not even that big. When you go, it's just like a tiny little picture. Artist workmanship, like Michelangelo's Sistine Chapel, like Van Gogh's Starry Night, right? These are things, you look at them, you can instantly recognize them. And those are some of the most famous pieces of art in history. They're masterpieces. It's their workmanship. It's Beethoven's Fifth Symphony. You hear that and you immediately know it. It's Tchaikovsky's 1812 Overture. You know these pieces of workmanship. We have one more, Bach's Toccata and Fugue in D minor. Fugue. You hear them and you know them. They're famous for a reason, because it's a workmanship. It's craftsmanship. It's something that can't be replicated, the kind of art that only one individual can do, and that's what you represent. That's what you carry in your DNA, is that God, the creator of all things, crafted you, and you are his famous piece of artwork. And those are all-time works of art, but they pale in comparison to what God did when he created you. David wasn't important enough in the eyes of the people closest to him to even be invited to meet the prophet. The eyes of the people, like, no one was, hey, they said to bring all of Jesse's sons. What about the kid that watches the livestock? He wasn't even on the radar, but he was important enough to God to be chosen and anointed the next king of Israel. Rebecca, if you want to come up. God didn't choose the one who looked the part. He chose the one who had the right heart. And I want to have you understand this about David, and for you to understand this about you, that the outside that other people see, it's not relevant, but if you can make your heart right with God, he will be able to do extraordinary things through you and in you. He doesn't need professional, trained, specialty people. He simply needs you, wherever you're at in your life today, to simply surrender to him, to be obedient. Obedience always results in blessing. And I know you and I, we have a lot of ideas, we have a lot of thoughts, we have a lot of ways we think things should be done, and we want to make our suggestions to the Lord, or sometimes we want to resist what we know the Lord has called us to do, and we say, I don't really want that, Lord. I'm going to wait until you get on the same page as me. That's the wrong attitude. Could you imagine if Jesse told Samuel, or Jesse blew it. Samuel was like, hey, do you have any more sons? And Jesse was like, nope, this is all of them. What a fool Jesse must have looked like when Samuel had to ask at the end of the line, hey, do you have any more sons? And he's like, sort of. When we don't do what God's called us to do, it puts us in really challenging environments. We create hardship for ourselves. Sometimes we blame God for it. We say, God, you did this to me, when God says, like, I wasn't part of those decisions that you were making. And so obedience, when we do what we know God has said to do, always brings blessing. Blessing doesn't mean things are going to be perfect. It might bring hardship, but it's hardship you're supposed to endure. Being chosen by God isn't about a popularity contest. It's about belonging to him. I want to read you one final passage in the New Testament. It's in the Message. Here's what it says. My beloved friends, let us continue to love each other since love comes from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and experiences a relationship with God. The person who refuses to love doesn't know the first thing about God, because God is love. So you can't know him if you don't love. This is how God showed his love for us. God sent his only son into the world so that we might live through him. This is the kind of love we're talking about. Not that we once upon a time loved God, but that he loved us and sent his son as a sacrifice to clear away our sins and the damage that they have done to our relationship with God. David was the runt, and your sin makes you the runt. It's a stain, it's a blemish. But because of the love of God, we become the pick of the litter through Jesus. Showing love and kindness to others matters more to God than having a fancy degree or life experience or fancy titles. And so when God says, I want obedience, he's, would you just love the way I love? Most people, their lives aren't greatly impacted by professionals. They're impacted by everyday people who show the love of God. Most people who come to the kingdom, it's because someone loved them in. They loved them enough to display who Jesus is so that they saw something missing from their lives and said, I need that same love from that same God. David didn't get it in his household growing up, but God was there for him through it all. And we're going to see all summer long the kind of person that David is, the kind of person he becomes, the reasons that God chooses him. David, who was forgotten by his family when Samuel came, will be mentioned more than 600 more times in the Old Testament and another 60 times in the New Testament. When people overlook you like they did David, I want you to remember that God looks at your heart, and he can lift you up into a position of fame and importance. He can bring you to the place he wants you to be. And you might not feel important or significant, but you, like David, are royalty in God's eyes. I want to ask you to just close your eyes and bow your head. I want to pray for you this morning.